Good evening. I'm Father Jeff Honneman, the priest in charge of St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington, Connecticut. And this is Storytime. Today, March 17th, as is well known, is the feast of St. Patrick, a saint much celebrated by the Roman Catholic Church and much beloved by the Irish people. Usually there are parades all across this country in his honor, dancing and singing in Irish pubs that dot this nation, and of course rivers of green beer flowing in the streets. This year is different because of the coronavirus and our desires as a people to mitigate its spread. Still, we mustn't forget St. Patrick. And as much as he's celebrated in this nation, most people don't really know a lot about him. For example, did you know that St. Patrick wasn't Irish? That he wasn't a Roman Catholic? And that he is officially not a saint of the Roman Catholic Church? If any of that surprises you, as it does many people, then listen up and hear the story of St. Patrick. The exact date of St. Patrick's birth is unknown, though it is certain that he lived sometime during the early part of the 5th century. 2 authentic letters written by Patrick himself survive, and from them come the only generally accepted details of his life. From those writings we learn that St. Patrick's father was a deacon in the church, and that his grandfather was a priest in the Christian church, but that Patrick as a youth wasn't much of a believer. Now, his father and grandfather were not clergy of the Roman Catholic Church. They were clergy of the early Celtic Church in what is now England. The Roman Catholic Church didn't arrive in England until 200 years later, until the time that St. Augustine of Canterbury and his party arrived on the far shores at the other end of the nation in what is now called Kent, in England. St. Augustine came to evangelize the island and was surprised when he arrived to discover that there was already a Christian church here, with bishops, priests, deacons, monks, a church that had existed at least from the latter half of the 2nd century, and a church that had a different style or feel about it than the Catholic Church on the continent. The Celtic Church was less hierarchical, closer to the common people, more spiritual, more friendly to women, more connected to nature, and more tolerant and comfortable in dealing with the ancient Celtic religions. The Celtic Church, for instance, kept the Orthodox date for Easter, which was confusing later, and as a result, the 2 churches called a synod at Whitby in the 8th century, where the Celtic Christians humbly agreed to abide by Roman Catholic use and practice. Well, this was long after the death of Patrick, who was then not a Roman Catholic, but a Celtic Christian. St. Patrick grew up in Cumbria, a region in the upper northwest part of Britain. Britain, the country so named by Julius Caesar, who conquered the island about 50 years before the birth of Christ, and who brought the great Roman Empire to the island. Cumbria is just south of Hadrian's Wall, which separated the Roman Britain from the wild territory to the north in Scotland, where the apostate Picts lived. Now, about the same time as Patrick lived, the Roman Empire in the west was in decline. The great city of Rome itself had been sacked recently and repeatedly by Vandals, and as a result, the Roman emperor had begun to withdraw his armies from distant lands like England to defend the homeland. So St. Patrick was a Brit, someone who lived in ancient Roman Britain, what we now call England, and who lived there just as the Roman armies were being recalled to the mainland. In the absence of the Roman army, various tribes began to raid and plunder Britain. The Picts in the north, the Irish in the west, and the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes in the east. This was a troubling time in England. This was the beginning of the Dark Ages. So when Patrick was about 16, he was captured by a group of Irish raiders who took him back and made him a slave in Ireland, where he was forced to work as a herdsman. At this time, Ireland was a land of druids and pagans. Patrick wrote that his faith grew in captivity, that he began to pray daily. After 6 years as a slave, he heard a voice telling him that he would soon go home. And then later he heard the voice tell him again that his ship was ready. So Patrick fled his master and walked more than 200 miles to a distant port, found a ship, and after various adventures, returned home to Britain, returned home to his family and friends, now in his early 20s. Patrick recounts that he had a vision a few years after returning home, where he saw a man from Ireland carrying many letters, and he gave one of them to Patrick. As he began the letter, Patrick imagined in that moment that he heard the voice of the people of Ireland saying, "We appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us." So Patrick returned to the island where he had previously been enslaved and began to preach Christianity as a Celtic bishop. But little is known exactly about the places where he worked, although later legends abound. From Patrick's own writings, we are told that he baptized thousands of people, that he ordained priests to lead these many Christian communities that were formed, that he converted wealthy women, some of whom became nuns, much to the distress of their family, and that he dealt decisively with the sons of kings, converting some of them too. Patrick's position as a foreigner in the land was not an easy one. Patrick refused to accept gifts from former kings, which placed him outside the normal ties of kinship and affinity, and was considered rude and improper. Legally, he was without protection, and he notes that on one occasion at least he was beaten, robbed of all that he had, and put into chains, fearing death. The exact details of Patrick's death are unfortunately unknown. St. Patrick is said to be buried at the cathedral in Downpatrick, alongside the graves of St. Bridget and St. Columba, two other great Irish saints and disciples of Patrick, though there is no confirming evidence of this burial. By the 7th century, hundreds of years after his death, Patrick has come to be revered as the patron saint of Ireland. Most other information we have about his life are from subsequent hagiographies, subsequent legends and stories, and are not generally accepted as factual. These later legends record, for instance, St. Patrick drove all the snakes out of the Ireland, chasing them into the sea after they attacked him during a 40-day fast he was undertaking on the top of a remote and distant hill. Archaeological fossil records suggested that at no time were there any trace of snakes in Ireland, so there was really nothing much for him to banish. These later legends also credit St. Patrick with teaching the Irish about the doctrine of the Holy Trinity by showing the people a shamrock, a three-leafed plant, using it to illustrate the Christian teaching of three persons in one God. For this reason, shamrocks are central for the celebrations of St. Patrick. But this legend is not found before the 18th century. Many of the other traditions associated with St. Patrick probably refer instead to Paldius, a saint who was sent by Pope Celsius I in 431 as a missionary to Ireland from France. Still, Patrick was beloved by the Irish people, revered as their patron saint. And for most of Christianity's first 1,000 years, canonizations were done on the local level, by the diocese or the region. Relatively soon after the death of a holy man, the local community would affirm his sanctity by honoring him in worship and in prayer, usually at the place of his death, and often on the day of his death. Shortly after his death, Patrick did indeed become a saint in the eyes of the Irish people. But St. Patrick has never been formally canonized by the Pope, as is necessary to be recognized as an official saint in the Catholic Church. He is instead a beloved Brit, a Celtic Christian, who loved the people who once enslaved him and who spent his life spreading the gospel among them. Let us go and do likewise. Let us pray. Almighty God, who in thy providence didst choose thy servant Patrick to be an apostle of the Irish people, to bring those who were wandering in darkness and error to the true light and knowledge of thee. Grant us so to walk in that light that we may come at last to the light of everlasting life. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. If this story time is of some use or value to you, please let me know, because there are lots of stories in the Christian church. And in this time of self-quarantine and social distancing, this is one way for us to connect, I hope. Regardless, may God bless you and keep you. Amen.